I was just trying to celebrate a quiet evening with my daughter when the restaurant's security guard leaned in and whispered, "Sir, I saw her pour something into your juice." The room kept laughing, but the glass in front of me felt like a trap. It hurt more than I can say, after a lifetime of paying her tuition, keeping our family afloat. This is what I faced, so I didn't argue. I walked away, and quietly met my lawyer the next morning. We pulled bank logs, real signatures, and the one thing they never expected, someone who saw everything. What happened next turned my own living room into a courtroom. Want to know how a 78-year-old father fought back without shouting and won? Stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. The air inside the restaurant was polished in that way where even the shine on the silverware seemed intentional. Stepping in alongside Arya and her husband Dorian, I told myself this was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone. Yet from the moment we entered, there was a distance, like an invisible pane of glass separating me from the world around me. Arya's heels clicked ahead of me as she scrolled her phone, tapping quickly, thumbs more loyal to the glow of her screen than to the father walking just a step behind. Dorian, broad-shouldered and neatly dressed, gave the host a nod before pulling out his credit card, his tone brisk, like he wanted to establish right away who carried the weight in this family now. Lowell Crane, the server assigned to us, met my eye as we followed to the table. He couldn't have been more than 30, but in that glance he offered a tiny flicker of sympathy, the kind that stung more than comforted. He placed a menu in front of me with extra care, as if he already sensed the imbalance at our table. The evening light from Boston's streets poured in through tall windows, fading into the glow of chandeliers overhead, the clink of glasses, the muted laughter of couples around us, even the polished jazz playing in the corner. It should have been comforting. Instead, I felt like an observer in my own family story. When Arya finally set her phone down, it wasn't to look at me. She waved to the server, ordering her drink before I had even opened my menu. "He'll take the same," she added with a glance that didn't quite land on me. My throat tightened, but I said nothing. Dorian leaned in, voice firm, as if he were giving a presentation to a boardroom. "Real estate in Cambridge is surging again. We should move fast. Dad's place would sell for a fortune." He spoke the words without pause, like I wasn't sitting right across from him. I held my hands together on the table. They had steadied her bicycle when she was small, paid her tuition checks, lifted boxes into her first apartment. All those years of sacrifice were memories that seemed to echo now only in my own head. To them, they had faded. Lowell returned with the drinks, his movements graceful, careful. He set down my glass of juice with a quiet respect, placing it directly in front of me. The cold condensation slid down its side, catching the glow of the overhead lights. Somehow, I noticed it more than anything else on the table, like it was waiting to play a role I hadn't yet understood. The food arrived, and I chewed politely, while the conversation drifted further away from me. Arya laughed at something Dorian whispered, her face turned toward him, shoulders angled away from me. Every subtle choice felt like a reminder that my place was slipping. I kept hearing the faint scrape of Lowell's shoes across the floor, his quiet presence in contrast to my daughter's cold detachment. When the band began to play, Dorian stood quickly, offering his hand to Arya. She smiled, genuine in a way she hadn't all night, and followed him to the dance floor. Music swelled, couples filled the space, the rhythm of saxophones and drums drawing them into a world of their own. Left at the table, I leaned back, cane against my leg, watching. Grief never fully leaves. It lingers in moments like this, when I could almost see my late wife across from me, her hand brushing mine, reminding me that family once felt warm. But the chair was empty, and the only company was a glass of juice growing warmer, its ice melting into slow rivulets. Around me, couples spun, laughter rose, and all I could do was sit in the middle of it, an island of silence. I stared at that untouched glass, the condensation pooling onto the linen, the way the light caught each droplet. Something in it demanded my attention. A sudden shadow fell across my shoulder. Jericho Madsen, the security guard, leaned down discreetly, his presence heavy but controlled. His voice was low, almost swallowed by the music. "Sir," he said, "I saw her pour something into your juice." The words pierced the haze of the evening. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Confusion slammed first. Surely he was mistaken. Then disbelief. Arya, my daughter. And then a wave of cold realization, heavy enough to sink through skin into bone. My hand gripped the cane tighter, knuckles whitening. I heard the muted hum of music, the shuffle of feet, the clink of glass from other tables, but they sounded far away, as if I were underwater. Jericho's hand rested briefly on the back of my chair, grounding me, while my eyes locked onto that glass. On the dance floor, Arya's laughter rang out, bright, ka. The glass sat there like an enemy I couldn't name. Beads of condensation slipped down its side, pooling onto the linen tablecloth. Eyes fixed on it. Not a finger moved closer. The warning from Jericho still echoed, heavy as iron. I saw her pour something into your juice. A man doesn't reach 78 without learning the weight of silence, years of raising a child, of giving everything so she might walk tall. And now the simplest act, lifting a glass, felt like stepping off a cliff. Gratitude pushed through the fog, whispered under my breath toward Jericho as he faded back into the room. No scene, no noise, just a quiet nod from me. Better to keep fear hidden than hand it over like a gift. Laughter carried across the restaurant before Arya and Dorian returned. They looked like any young couple who belonged in a place like this, smiles bright, steps light, as though the music from the dance floor clung to them. To anyone else, it was an ordinary night, but every note of her laughter cut sharp, hollowing me out. Arya slid back into her chair with an ease that burned. She leaned closer to Dorian, still grinning, her eyes catching mine for a fleeting second. Was it smugness, or just indifference? Either way, it stung. Dorian, always quick to fill the air, started again on numbers, investments, costs, futures, as if my presence at the table was nothing more than an obligation. His words rolled on, but none of them were for me. The juice sat between us, glowing under the overhead lights. I pushed it an inch away, careful, deliberate, no one noticed. Or maybe she did and just didn't care. Drops rolled down the glass like time slipping away. "You didn't touch your drink, Dad," Arya said, her tone coated with false concern. My hand rested on the table, steady though my chest rattled. "I wasn't thirsty," I answered, softer than I intended. She waved it off, motioning to Dorian with a smirk. "I know what's good for you." Those words, so simple, dug deep. Years of sacrifice reduced to mockery. Not care, but control. Her voice carried the arrogance of someone who believed she had already claimed victory. And the people around us laughed without knowing the theater they'd stumbled into. Memories pressed against me. Late nights working double shifts to pay for her schooling. The meals skipped so she could have more. The pride I felt when she first called me Dad in public. All of it now twisted into this bitter performance. Across the room, Jericho walked by again, just a passing figure in the elegant crowd, but his eyes caught mine. A glance quick and heavy. No mistake in them. His warning was real. The glass remained untouchable. My fingers tightened around the cane resting by my leg, knuckles whitening. Blood rushed loud in my ears, drowning the music, the chatter. Everything except her tapping nails against the wood of the table. A steady rhythm, careless. But to me it felt like a countdown. Arya's laughter rang again, sharp and bright. Yet all I heard was the sound of time slipping closer to something dark. Her laughter no longer sounded like joy. It echoed like a clock ticking down. The ride home passed in silence, city lights flashing across the windshield like blurred fragments of thought. The restaurant's laughter still echoed in my ears, not as warmth, but as an unsettling reminder of how far my daughter had drifted. By the time I stepped into the quiet of my own house, the weight of that glass I never touched still clung to me. The door closed behind me with a hollow thud. Inside, the air was thick with absence, the kind of silence only a widower knows. I moved through the hallway, the scent of old wood and faint lavender from my late wife's sachets trailing like ghosts. My jacket hung heavy on my arm. I pulled a napkin from the pocket, the one Lowell had slipped under the juice glass, still faintly damp. It lay in my hand as if it carried the entire burden of the night. Could Jericho have been mistaken? My daughter's hand, so steady as a child when she held mine crossing streets, now accused of treachery. The thought refused to sit quietly. It scraped at me like a stone in my shoe. I sank into the old leather chair in my study, its creak familiar, like a companion who never betrayed me. The ticking of the clock above the bookshelf was louder than usual, mocking every second of hesitation. Memory uncoiled without mercy. Arya at 10 years old, her hair in uneven braids, frosting smeared across her cheek as I carried a cake home after a 14-hour shift. She had clapped her hands, glowing with gratitude. That smile once lit my entire world. Years later, I worked extra hours when her mother's treatments drained our savings. I swallowed exhaustion so Arya could walk through the gates of her private school in polished shoes. Each bill paid felt like a battle won for her future. Now, the smirk she carried at that dinner table, it was the same curve of lips, yet it cut differently. Not joy, not gratitude, but calculation. That memory lanced through me, sharper than Jericho's warning. The phone vibrated on the desk, startling me. Mira's face filled the screen, her hair tousled from bed, eyes bright despite the late hour. "Good night. Grandpa, I love you," she whispered, her voice pure as morning light. The words cracked something open inside me. Mira's innocence stood in painful contrast to her mother's coldness. How could such warmth spring from a root already twisted? For a moment, my chest softened, the bitterness loosening. I smiled, though my throat burned. "Sleep well, sweetheart," I said, forcing steadiness into my voice. After the call ended, the silence deepened again, but it felt less like a tomb and more like a test. Mira's voice lingered, a thin thread pulling me back from despair. She was the anchor in this storm, proof that not everything Arya touched had turned to stone. I rose and crossed to the drawer in my desk, pulling it open with deliberate care. Inside lay the papers of a life built with sweat and sacrifice, deeds to the house, investments I had nurtured, and the latest draft of my will. My fingers rested on the folder, pulse quickening. If Arya's laughter had carried poison tonight, then she would not succeed in erasing me from my own legacy. My silence could no longer be mere endurance. It would have to become strategy, quiet observation, careful preparation. These would be my weapons. I closed the drawer sharply, the sound echoing like a gavel. Betrayal had marked this night, but it would not write the ending. "If my own daughter has turned against me," I whispered into the empty room, "then my silence must become my weapon." The drawer locked with a final click, but the memories refused to stay locked with it. The morning light crept through the blinds, but it brought no comfort. After a night spent pacing and staring at the ceiling, the weight of Jericho's words still pressed against my chest. I brewed a pot of coffee out of habit, but the steam rising from the cup felt like a cruel echo of the glass I'd left untouched the night before. My hand hovered above the mug, then pulled back. The thought of drinking anything I hadn't poured myself was enough to make my throat close. Instead, I sat at my desk, the surface cluttered with papers, folders, and the old oak smell that had followed me for decades. This office had once been the heart of stability, my fortress of ledgers and family milestones. That morning, it felt like a vault of secrets I had yet to uncover. Pulling open drawers, I began sorting through the familiar: bank statements, old letters, photographs, with edges softened by time. My cane leaned against the chair, steady but silent, as though it too was waiting for me to find something worth fighting for. And then I did. At first, the folder looked like the others, neat, labeled in my handwriting, but the weight of the paper inside was wrong, too thin, too new. When I opened it, the world shifted. Legal documents stared back at me, power of attorney papers, a draft of a will. My name was on every page, but the signatures weren't mine. The pen strokes were shaky, inconsistent, like someone trying to mimic a hand they didn't understand. And there it was, her name, Arya, bold letters, printed cleanly across the lines that mattered most. Controlling beneficiary. My fingers trembled, not from age but from fury. My voice came out in a rasp, barely audible even to myself. Someone had already written me out of my own life. I read and reread every page. The language was slick, buried in legal terms, but the intent screamed at me. If these documents were ever pushed through, I'd be nothing more than a ghost in my own house, stripped of choice, of power, of legacy. By noon, I found myself outside Victor Hale's office. The brass plaque on the door glinted in the afternoon sun, the same plaque I'd trusted for years. Victor had been my lawyer since before Arya was born. If there was one man who could cut through this web, it was him. He greeted me with his usual calm, the kind of presence that steadied storms. "Roland," he said, ushering me inside. "You look like you haven't slept." I didn't waste time. The papers landed on his desk with a sharp slap. "Tell me these aren't what I think they are." Victor adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents with a lawyer's precision. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock on his wall. Then he looked up, his face pale with controlled anger. "These are forgeries," he said flatly. "Whoever prepared these knew enough to make them convincing, but not enough to pass my eye. The signatures are wrong, too deliberate in some places, too careless in others." I felt my jaw tighten. "Arya's name is everywhere." Victor leaned back, folding his hands. "Roland, this isn't just betrayal. This is a calculated legal trap. If these had been filed at the right time, in the right court, your voice would have been silenced." The words sank deep, cutting sharper than any insult Arya had ever thrown my way. My anger solidified, heavy and unyielding. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't childish rebellion. This was theft dressed in paperwork, betrayal inked into permanence. Victor's voice softened. "We can counter this, quietly. But you mustn't confront her now. Not yet. Let her believe you're blind to it. That will be your advantage." I nodded, though every part of me burned to slam the papers into Arya's hands and demand an explanation. But rage would give her ground. Silence would take it back. That night, at my desk once again, I opened a fresh notebook. On the first page, I wrote a date. Then the words: Jericho saw her at the restaurant. Papers discovered today. Victor confirmed forgeries. Each detail would be recorded. Every glance, every conversation, every slip of the tongue. If she thought age had dulled me, she would soon learn memory could be sharper than any blade. I picked up one of the forged documents, held it above a candle flame. The edges curled, darkening, but I pulled it back before fire could consume it. The page trembled in my hand as I whispered, "Not yet." Not until the truth could be revealed in a way that would leave no doubt. They thought the papers would erase me. They didn't know I had already started writing my own ending. The invitation had arrived wrapped in polite words, as if it were a gesture of warmth. Family dinner at Arya's home. A week had passed since Victor showed me the forged papers, and the weight of that knowledge traveled with me into her front door. The house itself stood as proof of how far she had drifted. Marble floors, imported rugs, chandeliers casting their glow on walls lined with art. I knew she hadn't bought with her own money. My savings, my sacrifices, lingered in every corner. The scent of rosemary chicken floated from the kitchen, but instead of making me feel at home, it pressed like a hand on my chest. I carried my small notebook in my jacket pocket, the leather worn from use. That little book had become my companion, each page holding details I refused to let slip. Tonight, I wasn't walking into dinner as a guest. I was walking in prepared. Arya greeted me with a smile too polished, the kind meant for strangers at a fundraiser. "Dad, you made it," she said, kissing the air near my cheek. Dorian followed, hand gripping my shoulder a shade too firm. "Good to have you here, sir. We've got a lot to talk about over dinner." The table was laid with silverware that gleamed under candlelight, wine glasses already poured. I noticed a place setting where my juice glass waited, untouched, a thin curl of condensation rolling down its side. The memory of Jericho's words flared, and I shifted my gaze away. We began eating with the quiet clinking of utensils. For a moment, it felt almost ordinary. Then Dorian leaned back, dabbing his mouth with a napkin. "You know, Roland," he began, casual but heavy. "There comes a point when managing paperwork, bills, and property gets overwhelming. Maybe it's time you think about retirement papers. Handing things over could make life easier." The chicken on my fork cooled before I brought it to my mouth. Arya picked up his thread, her voice softer, laced with rehearsed care. "Dad, you've done enough. You carried everything for so long. Let us handle it now. We just want you to enjoy yourself." The words might have sounded kind to anyone else, but I heard the iron beneath them, stripping me of independence, dressed up as love. I chewed slowly, letting the silence stretch. I decided to test them. My voice came low, steady. "Interesting thought. Speaking of handling things, I noticed some recent withdrawals from the joint accounts. Do either of you recall what those were for?" Dorian's fork paused mid-air. He recovered with a laugh, a touch too sharp. "Just routine expenses, nothing unusual," Arya added quickly. "You don't need to worry about those details. Dad, trust us." From the corner of my eye, I caught Lowell Crane, working tonight as a server for the private dinner, glance at me. His movements slowed as he set down a dish, as if he wanted to say something but couldn't. That hesitation alone told me enough. People had begun to notice the cracks. I nodded slightly, acknowledging him without a word. The meal continued. Though the air had thickened, Dorian launched into a story about an investment opportunity, but his words skimmed over me. My mind was on the folder Arya slid across the table just as dessert was served. "Dad," she said, her tone shifting from sweet to urgent, "this will make things official. Just a few signatures. You don't even have to read all the fine print." My hand hovered over the folder, palm resting on the smooth cover. "What is it?" "Papers that will make everything easier," Dorian interjected, his jaw tight. I didn't move. I simply looked at Arya. That silence made her flush. Her voice rose, sharp enough to turn heads in the kitchen. "Why can't you ever trust me?" The words rang louder than the clink of glasses. Lowell froze, tray balanced in his hands. Even Dorian's eyes flicked nervously toward the doorway. Aware staff might hear too much. I let the silence linger, the weight of her outburst echoing through the dining room. Slowly, I slid the folder back toward her. My voice was no more than a whisper, but it cut clear. "Not tonight." Her jaw tightened, her hand clutching the papers as though she might tear them in two. Dorian placed a hand over hers, muttering something low, but I didn't listen. I reached for my cane and stood, the scrape of the chair deliberate, leaving their house. I felt the air outside strike cooler than it had all week. My silence had said more than any argument could. They thought my quiet meant surrender. They had no idea silence could also be a blade. Victor's office always had the smell of leather and polished wood, a place where the weight of law felt heavier than the furniture itself. Sitting across from him, the echoes of last night's dinner still rattled in the back of my mind. Arya's sharp voice, Dorian's cold stare, and the folder that had nearly found my name shackled to their ambitions. I told Victor everything, each detail, each hesitation, and especially the way Arya's composure cracked in front of her own staff. He listened without interruption, his hands folded over a stack of files. When I finished, he leaned forward, his voice lower than the hum of the air conditioner. "Roland, this isn't just arrogance or neglect. Forged documents, staged dinners, emotional plays, that's a coordinated attempt at control. They're not waiting for you to step aside. They're pushing you out." The words landed like stones. I stared at my own hands resting on his desk, remembering how steady they once were when signing tuition checks, mortgages, and hospital bills. Now, those same hands trembled slightly at the thought of my daughter writing me out of my own life. Victor slid a folder across the desk. Inside were examples of my real signatures, notarized over the years. "We'll compile these. If they attempt anything, the comparison alone will tear their forgery apart." I nodded slowly. Silence. I realized wasn't weakness anymore. Silence was a ledger. Every look, every word, every signature forged against me, I would keep the receipts. Later that afternoon, Victor's voice grew sharper. "There's more." He pulled up a report on his screen, the glow of the monitor highlighting the lines on his face. "A transfer attempt. 2 days ago. Large sum. Moved from your account to an overseas holding. It was blocked when the verification failed. They used your name." For a moment, the room spun, not because of age or frailty, but because betrayal has a way of stealing the air from your lungs. My daughter wasn't just plotting with paper. She was already reaching into the vault of my years, clawing at what I had worked for. "They were already spending money I hadn't lost yet," I muttered, more to myself than to Victor. Anger pulsed hot in my chest, but I kept it contained. A man who explodes loses sight. A man who waits sees everything. Victor adjusted his glasses. "We'll act, Roland." Quietly, but decisively. "They want you out of the picture, but they've left fingerprints all over the stage." I gave him a thin smile, the kind I hadn't worn since the days of hard business negotiations. "Let them keep writing their play. I'll be the audience who remembers every line." That night, the house was silent when I returned. Too silent. The kind that makes you aware of every creak in the floorboards. I went straight to my study, locked the door, and opened the drawer where the forged papers lay. They stared back at me like predators waiting in the dark. I didn't touch them. I only opened my notebook, the one I now carried like a second heart, page after page. I wrote dates, dinners, conversations, the way Lowell Crane had hesitated while serving, the way Jericho's eyes had said more than his words, every mark of disrespect Arya had dressed as care. "I would not scream at them," I whispered, pen scratching steadily. "I would let their own signatures hang them." The rhythm of the ink steadied my pulse. Each line I wrote felt like mortar in the wall I was building, one brick higher, one stone stronger than their schemes. Near midnight, the phone rang. The screen showed blocked number. I answered, waiting. Her voice came sharp, cutting through the static. "Dad, don't make this harder than it has to be. You've done enough. Just don't fight us on this." For a moment, I didn't breathe. There it was, fear disguised as control. I didn't reply. I let her words hang, like laundry left out in the rain. When the silence stretched too long, she added, almost frantic, "We're only trying to help you." I ended the call without a word. Closing my notebook, I pressed the cover flat with my palm, steady and deliberate. "Now I know they're afraid," I whispered. "Fear is the first crack in any fortress," and I had just heard theirs echo through the phone. The hall was filled with the buzz of conversation, silverware clinking against china, and the hollow laughter of people trying too hard to look united. I stood near the back, cane in hand, watching my daughter orchestrate what she called a family gathering. Arya's smile was the kind that showed teeth but no warmth. Dorian lingered at her side, hand resting possessively on a folder he carried as if it were a crown. When they finally called for silence, I knew what was coming. Arya lifted the folder high, her voice echoing through the hall. "I want to share something important with everyone here. For too long, Dad has been carrying the weight of responsibility. It's time to acknowledge the truth. He can't handle it anymore." Gasps scattered like dropped glasses. She opened the folder and spread documents across the table at the front. Dorian stepped in smoothly, as though rehearsed. "These are the papers proving that Roland has already signed over control. For his safety, and frankly, for all of ours. He's just not the same man he used to be." The air tightened. Whispers slithered through the crowd. Some shook their heads with pity. Others eyed me as though I were a burden that needed putting away. My name, my dignity, was being chipped apart with every carefully spoken lie. Arya turned her gaze on me, wide-eyed, rehearsed. "Dad, you agreed to this, remember?" She tapped the pages. "We all want what's best for you." I did not answer. My silence carried more weight than her performance. The urge to shout, to tear those forged papers in half, rose like fire in my chest. But Victor's words lingered. Silence makes their lies louder than your anger ever could. I walked slowly forward, each step a deliberate measure, as though my cane marked the beat of a different truth. I let my eyes rest on the pages she displayed. At first glance, the signatures looked like mine. The strokes had been practiced, the pressure mimicked, even the hesitant loop I sometimes left on the R. To the untrained eye, it was perfect, but I saw what others wouldn't. The date was off by 2 months. On that day, I had been in Victor's office signing something entirely different. The ink was glossy, too new for a document that supposedly sat for weeks, and one notary stamp was crooked, rushed. Arya's voice sharpened. "See? He doesn't even remember." I leaned closer, adjusted my glasses, and studied the notary stamp. Then I straightened slowly, pressing my lips together as if conceding. My hand brushed one of the copies. Instead of tearing it, I slipped it into my jacket pocket. A few guests might have thought I was simply indulging my daughter's request to keep a memento. In truth, I had taken my first piece of evidence in front of everyone. My silence was not surrender, it was bait. The next morning, I sat across from Victor Hale in his office. He skimmed through the papers I'd pocketed, his expression tightening with each page. Finally, he set them down and removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "They're good," he admitted. "Better than most forgeries I've seen in 30 years. A chill ran through me. If Victor, meticulous and cautious, admitted they were nearly flawless, then my daughter had invested time and money in this scheme. But here," Victor continued, tapping one page with a sharp finger, "this notary stamp belongs to a clerk who retired 2 years ago. Someone used an outdated seal." The flaw was small but fatal. Relief didn't come as joy. It came as a slow, simmering anger. "So it's proven," I muttered. "They've tried to bury me alive with paper." Victor nodded gravely. "We'll build a case. But prepare yourself. This will not be just legal. They'll attack your reputation, your sanity. Be ready." I closed my eyes briefly, hearing the murmur of whispers from last night, people looking at me as if I were slipping, as if I were fading away. Arya wanted them to see me as a ghost before I was even gone. That evening, back at my house, the weight of the hall's echoes still pressed on me. I lowered myself into my chair by the window, the city lights reflecting in the glass. A sound startled me, a soft scrape at the door. When I checked, there was no knock, no voice. Only an envelope slid beneath the frame, my name scrawled in bold black letters. With careful hands, I opened it. Inside was a photograph. Mira, my granddaughter, smiling outside her school, oblivious to whoever had been behind the camera. Beside it, a note written in uneven strokes. "Stay quiet, or she pays for your pride." For the first time in years, my hand trembled. Not from age, not from weakness, but from fury. I pressed the photo to my chest, breathing through the storm. They had reached for the only light left in my life, the one soul whose love had not dimmed. And in that instant, I understood. They thought fear would chain me. Instead, it sharpened my resolve. The living room no longer felt like mine. Arya and Dorian had arranged the gathering under the guise of family discussion. But the moment everyone filed in, it became clear this was a trial. My trial. The curtains were drawn, lamps buzzing low, and the faces of cousins, neighbors, and a few distant relatives lined the room with uneasy anticipation. Arya stood at the center, like she owned the house. "Dad has been struggling," she began, voice pitched just loud enough to carry across the room. "We love him, of course, but he's confused, unstable. That's why we need to take steps, for his sake and for the family's." The word unstable landed like a slap. Dorian chimed in, brandishing a folder fat with papers. "He already signed the property transfer. He just doesn't remember. It's tragic, really." Murmurs rippled across the room. Eyes darted toward me, some filled with pity, others with suspicion. I gripped my cane tighter, the wood warm in my hand, but kept my silence. I had learned, their lies grow louder when my voice does not interrupt them. Arya leaned forward, the light catching on her jeweled earrings. "Dad, it's time you stop fighting. You can't manage everything anymore. It's dangerous for you. For all of us." The words dripped with false concern, the same tone she used when ordering my dinner without asking. But this was my home, my chair, my walls, and she dared to call me unfit. Dorian spread the papers across the coffee table, pushing them toward the guests. "Here, proof. He agreed to let us manage the assets. These are his signatures." The whispers swelled. "Looks real," one voice muttered. Another said, "Poor man, doesn't know what he's doing." I let the noise build, let it wash over me like the tide against stone. Then, slowly, I raised my head. "If I'm so unstable," I said, voice steady, "why are you shouting in my living room instead of caring for me?" The silence that followed was sharper than any yell. I pulled out my own folder. "Papers prepared by Victor Hale. You say I sign those, then explain this." Gasps fluttered as I spread the true documents. My real will, my notarized statements, proof of my intact accounts. "Notice the dates, notice the stamps. My attorney verified these yesterday." Arya's painted smile cracked. Dorian's jaw tightened. Lowell Crane, standing quietly at the back, stepped forward. "I don't want to be in the middle of family matters," he said, voice low. "But I was there at dinner last week. I heard them pressing him to sign papers. He refused." A hush fell. Truth had entered the room, and then a softer truth pierced through. Mira slipped in from the hallway, her little voice rising above the silence. "Why is everyone shouting at Grandpa?" Every heart skipped, my chest clenched. I nodded gently to the sitter, who quickly ushered her back to the den, but her question lingered, heavier than any legal proof. Arya snapped. She lunged forward, snatching at the papers in my hands. "Stop this!" Chaos erupted, relatives standing, voices colliding in accusation and defense. Dorian's voice boomed. "He's manipulating all of you." Before her fingers reached the documents, Jericho Madsen stepped between us. Broad frame, a wall of calm force. "That's enough," he said firmly. "This ends without violence." Arya's face flushed crimson. She spat words that tangled in her throat. Her poise shattered. Dorian tried to pull her back, his grip too tight, exposing his desperation. Through it all, I stayed seated. The cane balanced across my knees, my breath measured. "The truth doesn't need to shout," I said, voice carrying through the clamor. "It only needs time to be seen." Victor Hale stood then, briefcase in hand, his calm presence cut through the chaos. "This discussion is over," he declared. "Tomorrow morning, evidence will be presented in Suffolk County Probate Court. Every forged document will be exposed, every false claim dismantled." The color drained from Arya's cheeks. Dorian's knuckles whitened around her wrist. For the first time, their power seemed brittle, fragile under the weight of daylight. I rose slowly, cane tapping against the hardwood. Each step echoed like a verdict. No yelling, no theatrics. Just a father walking away from the ashes of his children's lies. The room fell silent, all eyes following me as I crossed the threshold. They thought fear would chain me. Instead, it sharpened my resolve. The house had gone silent after that storm of a night. The echoes of shouting, papers rustling, and Jericho's steady hand keeping chaos from spilling over still lingered in my ears. But silence held a different weight now. It wasn't mine to bear alone. For the first time, I could feel the suspicion turning in their direction. Neighbors, cousins, old friends who had been invited under false pretenses. They'd watched Arya's mask slip. Whispers had started almost immediately. In the hall, I caught the sideways glances, the uncertain nods, words like forged, unfit, and what if he's right floated in the air as people shuffled out. My daughter's carefully constructed image of the dutiful caretaker cracked in front of them. I hadn't needed to raise my voice. Their own arrogance had shouted louder than I ever could. At home. I sat in my chair by the window, Kane resting against the armrest, replaying the looks I'd seen on their faces. Pity had turned to doubt, and doubt was the seed of collapse. I knew the tide was shifting, not because of anything I had said, but because silence, used carefully, was louder than rage. The next morning, I met Victor Hale at his downtown office. The man always looked like he had just stepped out of a courtroom. Crisp suit, glasses polished, his desk in neat order except for the pile of files that grew taller each week. He gestured for me to sit. "Roland, last night was important," he said, tapping the edge of a folder. "You didn't need to prove them wrong. They proved themselves untrustworthy." I leaned forward, my hands clasped tighter than I wanted to admit. "Did anyone else notice?" Victor's eyes flicked to the file. "Jericho Madsen did. He called me first thing this morning. He's prepared to testify. His statement aligns perfectly with your suspicions about the restaurant night." That changes everything. Relief pressed against my chest, but it didn't soften me. Jericho's word meant the poisoned glass wasn't just a ghost haunting me. It was evidence. For years I had carried betrayal in silence, letting it hollow me out. Now, silence was being traded for proof. Victor pushed a paper toward me. "You've held back long enough. With Jericho and the inconsistencies in the documents, we have leverage. But understand, this won't just be a legal fight. They'll come at you with every weapon they have left. And desperation makes people dangerous." I nodded, the weight of his warning settling deep. Let them come. Later that afternoon, my phone lit up with Mira's name. Her small voice came through, pure as spring water. "Grandpa, Mommy's mad. Did you do something bad?" Her words struck like an arrow. My throat tightened, but I kept my tone gentle. "No, sweetheart. Grown-ups sometimes argue when they don't agree. But none of this is your fault." "I love you," she whispered, almost afraid to say it aloud. "I love you too, more than anything." When the call ended, I sat with the silence again, but it was lighter this time. Mira's voice had reminded me why I was fighting. Not for money, not even for my name carved into deeds or accounts. I was fighting so she would grow up knowing that dignity mattered, that truth could outlast lies. That evening, Victor called again with an update. "It's starting," he said. "Financial partners are stepping back from Dorian. Some neighbors called me, asking questions about Arya. The smear campaign is cracking, but they're not going quietly." I could almost see it. Arya scrambling to control the narrative. Dorian weaving half-truths to anyone who would listen, but for every accusation they threw, the ground under them shifted a little more. Whispers carried faster than their rehearsed speeches, and each rumor turned back toward them. I opened my notebook and drew a line under the last entry. Beneath it, I wrote one sentence. "This is only the first crack. The walls will fall, leaning back." I closed the cover slowly, my hand firm. Fear no longer sat on my shoulders. For the first time, I saw fear in theirs, and it wasn't mine to carry anymore. The courthouse steps gleamed under the weak Boston sun, gray stone catching the light like a stage built for judgment. Victor Hale walked beside me, his briefcase tucked close, his pace steady. We had just filed the injunction to freeze the assets Arya and Dorian thought were already theirs. For the first time in weeks, the weight in my chest loosened. Dignity, long buried beneath their sneers and schemes, stretched its limbs and stood tall again. Reporters clustered at the bottom of the steps, voices sharp and eager, questions flying about betrayal, family, and money. I didn't answer. Silence, I had learned, spoke louder than their microphones ever could. The courthouse doors shut behind us with a finality that rang in my ears. Each echo of my cane against the stone was a reminder. I was not beaten. I had brought this fight into the open, and now the law itself was in play. They wanted me erased quietly, but I had written my name in the public record where they couldn't smudge it out. By afternoon, the news had spread, and so had Arya's fury. At a local community event that evening, she let her anger loose. Her voice carried over the crowd, calling me delusional, accusing me of fabricating stories and manipulating sympathy. I wasn't there in person, but the whispers reached me through neighbors who had stood in the crowd, shocked at the venom in her words. Dorian tried to steady her, his lawyer's polish failing as he stumbled over phrases meant to sound professional, but her voice cracked under the strain, her face flushed, her hands trembling. Some clapped for her, believing the act, but more stood silent, eyes narrowed with doubt. They had heard Jericho's testimony. They had seen the forged papers, and whispers of their schemes had started to seep into every corner of our circle. Arya's perfect facade had finally begun to splinter in public. Later that evening, my phone lit up with a call. Mira's little voice, soft and sweet, cut through the day's noise. "Grandpa, why is Mommy so mad all the time?" she asked. The question pierced me deeper than any accusation ever could. How could a child so innocent already feel the weight of her mother's rage? I steadied my voice, choosing words carefully. "Sometimes, Mira, grown-ups make mistakes. They let fear and greed twist them, and it makes them angry." But that doesn't mean they stop loving you." There was a pause, then her small whisper, "I trust you, Grandpa." That moment anchored me. All the lawsuits, the forged papers, the whispers in family gatherings, they were storms raging around me. But that child's trust was a lighthouse, and it reminded me what this fight was truly for. Not money, not pride, but the truth I wanted her to inherit when she was old enough to understand. When the house grew quiet that night, I sat at my desk. Evidence spread before me. Legal drafts, notarized signatures, Victor's meticulous notes, each page a shield. My hands no longer shook. I thought of all I had lost. Time, respect, the illusion of love from a daughter who had turned into a stranger. Yet what remained was unshakable. Truth. And truth had its own kind of power. Near midnight, the phone buzzed again, this time with a new message. A summons. Court papers for Arya and Dorian. Their names etched in black ink on crisp white pages. I held the envelope carefully, almost reverently. This was not revenge. This was accountability. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the room lit only by the amber glow of a desk lamp. Tomorrow, they wouldn't just face me, the old man they thought too weak to fight. Tomorrow, they would face the law itself, the same law they believed they could bend. "Tomorrow," I whispered, sliding the papers into my drawer. "They won't just face me, they'll face the law they thought I was too weak to call upon." The oak-paneled walls of the Boston courthouse seemed to breathe with the weight of generations. Sitting there, Kane at my side, I felt both smaller than ever and more determined than I had been in years. The murmur of voices carried like a low tide, and I could sense eyes flicking from me to the daughter who once smiled with birthday candles in her eyes. Now she sat across the aisle, her lawyered husband whispering legalese in her ear, her posture stiff but her fingers restless against the table. Victor leaned toward me, calm as always. "We focus on the drink, Roland, and the papers. The rest will follow." His voice was measured, deliberate, a steadying hand across the storm brewing inside me. Arya lifted her chin when our gazes met. There was no trace of remorse, no flicker of the girl I had raised, only defiance. Dorian gave a thin smile, the kind a man wears when he thinks he has the upper hand, even as the floor shifts beneath him. The bailiff called the court to order, and the silence that followed pressed heavy on every chest. My heartbeat matched the tick of the second hand above the bench. The judge, sharp-eyed, wasted no time. "We are here to determine the validity of contested property documents and allegations of attempted harm." His voice was iron-wrapped in cloth. I exhaled slowly, gripping the table edge, reminding myself that truth needed no decoration. Jericho Madsen's boots echoed against the floor as he took the stand. He was steady, broad-shouldered, still carrying the quiet authority of a man used to watching without being seen. The oath was given, and then Victor's questions began. "Mr. Madsen, on the evening of March 14th, Where were you employed? At the Mariners Club restaurant in Boston, he answered, his voice plain, unwavering. Did you observe the defendant, Aria Laverne, engage in any unusual behavior? Jericho's eyes cut toward Aria, then back to the judge. Yes, sir. I saw her pour something into Mr. Kemper's drink while he was distracted. Gasps rustled through the room. A woman in the gallery whispered, "Oh my God." Before being hushed, my breath caught in my chest, even expecting it. Hearing the words aloud was like an arrow piercing a wound. Aria shot to her feet. That's a lie. Her voice cracked against the wooden walls. The judge slammed his gavel once, sharp as a rifle shot. Sit down, Ms. Laverne. You'll have your turn. Jericho's composure never faltered. I've worked security for 15 years. My job is to notice. And that night, I noticed. Dorian leaned into Aria, hissing something I couldn't hear. She sank back into her chair, color rising to her cheeks, but the fury in her eyes burned hotter than the gavel's command. I sat still, but inside, a storm of relief and grief churned together. Relief that truth had stepped into the light, grief that it had come to this, to needing strangers to tell the world what a father already knew in his bones. During recess, I felt a tug at my sleeve. Mira, small and bright-eyed, had slipped through the crowd to find me. She climbed onto the bench beside me, whispering as if the whole world might be listening. Grandpa, I know you're telling the truth. The simplicity of her words almost undid me. I fought back the sting in my eyes, placing a hand over her tiny fingers. Sometimes, sweetheart, truth takes a long time to be heard. She hugged me tightly, and in that moment, the weight of every betrayal felt lighter. I realized that no verdict could erase what truly mattered, being the grandfather she believed in. She was the reason I hadn't broken under the silence, the reason my fight carried meaning beyond paper and ink. When her mother called her away with a sharp tone, Mira looked back at me once, her innocence cutting through the stale air of the courthouse like sunlight through storm clouds. The session resumed, tension thickening as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. The judge's gaze swept the room. I will remind both parties, contempt of this court will not be tolerated. His words aimed squarely at Aria, who shifted uneasily under the weight of authority she could not bend. Victor rose again, a sealed folder in his hand. His voice carried the quiet gravity of a man holding dynamite. Your Honor, we present notarized property deeds recently surfaced. The signatures claim to belong to Mr. Kemper, but forensic analysis suggests forgery. Aria's face drained of color. Dorian stiffened, his jaw working, eyes darting for an exit that didn't exist. The judge took the documents, adjusting his glasses, scanning the stamps. His brows lifted slightly before he set them aside. These will be reviewed thoroughly. Until then, this court will adjourn for the day. Further examination will continue tomorrow. The gavel struck again, each bang a hammer against the lies that had wrapped around my life. As the crowd dispersed, Aria sat frozen, her hands clenched so tight her knuckles whitened. Dorian leaned toward her, whispering urgently, but for once, she didn't respond. The fortress they built had begun to crumble, brick by fraudulent brick. Walking out of the courthouse, Kane tapping the marble steps. I felt no triumph, only clarity. This wasn't victory yet, but it was the first true sunrise after years of storm. The path ahead was still uncertain, but the lies were losing ground. Tomorrow, the weight of evidence would finish what their poison had started. Tomorrow, truth would no longer whisper. It would roar. The morning sun over Boston carried a weight I hadn't felt in years. Light poured through the tall courthouse windows, glinting off polished wood and the silent faces of strangers who had gathered to watch the end of a family torn apart. I sat tall, cane in hand, my breath even. This was Judgment Day, not just for Aria and Dorian, but for the years of silence I had endured. The judge's voice rang steady, each word slicing through the room. The court finds Aria Laverne and Dorian Vassal guilty of forgery, fraud, and attempted elder abuse. Gasps rippled through the benches. Some leaned forward. Others shook their heads in disbelief. My heart beat steady, not in triumph, but in calm. Across the aisle, Aria's face crumpled. She leapt to her feet, shrieking, "No! You can't take this from me!" The bailiff held her back as she pounded her fists against the table. Dorian sat frozen, his head bowed, unable to look at me or anyone else. The fortress they had built on lies was collapsing, and I didn't need to raise my voice to watch it fall. Jericho Madsen's testimony had been clear, unwavering. He had no reason to lie, no stake in the outcome. Victor Hale's documents, notarized with precision, told a story the forged papers could never cover. Even the financial records betrayed them, showing transfers they had tried to hide. The judge continued, his words deliberate. All claims to Mr. Roland Kemper's estate are nullified. Restitution is ordered. This court will not tolerate exploitation of the vulnerable. I sat still, hands folded over my cane. Aria collapsed into her chair, sobbing with rage, while Dorian's silence screamed louder than any denial. For years, I had wondered if my restraint would ever mean anything. In that moment, it meant everything. Through the chaos, a small figure appeared. Mira. She was guided gently to me by an attendant. Her wide eyes searching mine, I reached out, and she nestled into my arms. The storm of shouting and papers fluttering around us faded. She was safe, and that was victory enough. That evening, back home, the house felt different. For once, silence was not heavy. It was peaceful. A cup of tea steamed on the table beside me. I opened my notebook. The pages filled with dates, notes, fragments of a fight I never wanted but could not avoid. Slowly, I closed it and placed it on the shelf. It had done its job. Mira sat on the floor nearby, sketching clumsy pictures of houses and stick figures. I watched her and spoke softly, though perhaps more to myself than to her. You don't fight family with anger, sweetheart. You fight lies with truth. That's what protects dignity. She looked up, nodding though I knew she didn't fully understand. One day, she would. The last of the evening light fell across my study. I thought back to the sacrifices, nights of overtime to pay for Aria's tuition, years spent nursing my wife, the small joys and disappointments of family life. Pain had carved deep scars, but it had also left behind resilience. We cannot choose what our children become, I whispered, but we can choose to remain true to ourselves. I rose and looked out the window. In the yard, Mira played, her laughter light, untainted by greed or betrayal. That sound was my true legacy. Not money, not houses, not papers. Dignity, resilience, honesty. Those would outlive me. For anyone listening, anyone who had sat through this story, I offer this. Age is not weakness. Silence is not surrender. And truth, even when buried under betrayal, always rises.